Recording in progress. 3, 2, 1.
Hey everyone, and thank you so much for tuning in to the Engagement Labcast. Welcome to episode 6. This is Jessie Del Fierro, one of the co-hosts of the lab, and I am joined by my ever so fabulous co-host, Andrés Moreno.
Woo! Thanks, Jesse. Welcome to the episode. We're really excited about this one. It is our final online session episode, which feels wild to even consider. But we've come to the end of our online sessions, and that feels really cool. We had our panelists in for our final session, and then as we started talking about how to wrap this up, we found this great facilitator who started in our community and is now working nationally in many different communities. And they happen to have a great workshop that aligned really beautifully with what we wanted to kind of bring in for our final conversation. Jesse, do you want to tell us a little bit about it?
Absolutely. So our process that has led us to the 6th session is we've had one-on-one interviews. We started hearing back from our participants. So we went into the solo creation opportunities. This was an opportunity for folks to explore internally and also reflect on their communities about what they are seeing in their community and ways that they wish to engage. And then we went into our 5th session, and this is with our panelists, Shima Robinson, Cole Alvis, and Heidi Taylor. And this is an opportunity to witness and bring in curiosity to what other folks in our greater community, national community, are doing around this work. And so now we've had our local inspiration about what's going on in the Alberta theater scene. We've seen ways that folks across Canada have approached these situations and circumstances. And now we're really excited to bring in Makram Ayache to talk about bridging these two ideas. And so from going from inspiration and intention, discovery and curiosity, and now emerging into how we can bring this work into action that aligns with who we are as individuals, aligns with the community we live and work and exist in, and draw inspiration from work that's ongoing.
It was a really great session, and I thought it was a really good one to close us off. I mean, as always, I wish we had 3 times the amount of time, because we could have talked about this for so long. But yeah, it was a really great ending to our online sessions, and I hope you enjoy the conversation we had with Makram.
Enjoy. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for this gorgeous episode of the Engagement Lab podcast. I'm so honored to welcome our guests today, Makram Ayache. Would you care to introduce yourself?
Sure. My name is Makram Ayache. I'm a theater creator, an artist generally. I've done anti-oppression education and training primarily with arts organizations. And I am a huge fan of the Marvel Cinematic Universe and the comic books, I'll be clear also.
I'm so behind, unfortunately, maybe not unfortunately, but that's okay.
I'm so glad you brought in the comic books as well. I'm like, you can't be a fan of one without the other.
That's right. That's when you know the true fans. Yeah.
Well, Makram, thank you so much for being here today, and thank you for being a part of our final session for the Engagement Lab. It's wild to think that this started a year and a half ago and we're finally finished and being able to have retrospective time. So we wanted to make sure that we had a conversation with you now that you've done this session, and kind of just ask you some questions about what your impressions were, some of the advantages and challenges you've seen, and just kind of your curiosities for our community moving forward. So to kind of start us off, I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about the advantages that you kind of experienced or the challenges when you came in to kind of give us a workshop for the final session.
I think what I'm always afraid of and mindful of is when we come together in these spaces of learning and there's someone at the teacher at the front of the room, so to speak. There's a pressure that I feel of having a certain expertise, but this work is deeply communal, and it's not something that any one person holds any sort of authority on. And once we start going towards like, who are the authorities on how to make our theater spaces more anti-racist, or how to make our theater spaces more trans-inclusive, there are people that come with lived experiences, with expertise in that experience, but we don't. But I worry about not expertise. I worry about the pressure of being an expert. And so one of the challenges I found was I'm coming in with the knowledge that I know, and the knowledge that I know how to share at this point in my journey of emotionally, spiritually, intellectually, and communally thinking about these things and engaging and practicing these values. And I worry that I might get it wrong. And so the challenge always to come into a space where the Engagement Lab had a community of leaders, I know that they know things in a very embodied and practiced way. So the challenge for me is always my own insecurity about what can I bring, and what can I possibly share that's going to take us forward in the conversation. And sometimes in these kind of 2-hour workshop spaces, the danger is always we simplify complicated, ongoing, lifelong conversations into like effective, bite-sized, comfortable ideas. And this work isn't always comfortable. It shouldn't be comfortable. We're talking about changing systemic status quo in culturing. It's not going to be comfortable. So the advantage is that we have a team of leaders. So everybody's on board with you. Everybody's on this, leaning into the knowledge and leaning into their own understanding and embodied experience. And so the advantage is that I quickly realized I'm in a real rich community of care, which is necessary for this work.
And can you talk a little bit about the actual workshop that you brought into our space?
Yeah, I'm thinking about how certain knowledge is legitimized and conditioned into us from a very early age. And I'm thinking about my emotional and cultural capacity to unlearn and relearn. Like, we've heard these words, I'm unlearning, I'm listening, I'm unlearning, I'm, embracing new knowledges. But what does that really feel like in my body? What does that feel like in my practice? And I'm always not advocating that we just like toe the party line or we do things out of a dogmatic commitment. I think that becomes really dogmatic. That's a dangerous pathway for any sort of social change. So I'm really interested in the sublime and the spiritual transformation that's needed for integrating knowledge that is from what's called the subjugated knowledge. How do we integrate subjugated knowledge? And as a queer Arab person, I intuitively know and understand and gravitate towards certain subjugated knowledges. But someone like me who's grown up in the Western world, like, look at us, we're all speaking here in English today. That's a hegemonic power over us that has compelled us to have this situation. We all know that our Canadian passports are what empower us in this world, and we would know that even more if we didn't have Canadian passports. Like, there are hegemonic powers that we've been conditioned to embrace and accept and hold with authority. And the subjugated knowledges that I wanted to talk about in the workshop, it takes a real active and deliberate effort to embody, to embrace, and to feel in alignment and in conviction with, in like the same authority, with the same authority that your driver's license has, or your contract with your landlord for rent, or your mortgage. Like, that authority, that level of authority. Do you have that level of authority when you're engaging with an Indigenous elder in the community or the region that you live in on Turtle Island? However their contractual bindings operate, do you have the same authority personally, let alone culturally? Of course, culturally, we know that power is not legitimized in Canada, in colonial Canada. But how do we embrace it on a personal level? And hopefully the amalgamation of all our personal legitimizing of that knowledge becomes something that is culturally legitimate. So that's what I brought into the workshop. That's what I'm wrestling with and what I'm curious about. And, I've been in this world, I've been in this work for 10-ish years, maybe. And I could say like, it's always a challenge. It's always a challenge. It's like integrating knowledges that are so far out of my own learned and cultured experiences is not easy work, but I know it because I come from my own subjugated knowledges. I come from my own queer experiences, from my Arab experiences. So I know that those knowledges are valid. So I have to believe that the knowledges of Indigenous people, of Black people, of trans people, of disabled people, those knowledges are just as valid. So imagine you come from a place of extreme privilege and power where the world constantly operates in your image. That's a hard thing to ask someone to legitimize knowledges that don't come from their experience. That's a hard thing. So I'm interested in what is the spiritual, deep, emotional, sublime work, because I think therein is maybe a process that can engage all of us.
That's beautiful. Thank you for sharing that. And in this process of your work, what have you noticed when you've brought this work up in your communities? Have you noticed, particularly from colonial Canadian institutions, certain curiosities or challenges that may have come up that you find has been a common thing that we're all sort of interrogating and working through together?
Yeah, I've definitely noticed that things that are low stakes, which often, because I work as a theater artist, a theater creator, writer, actor, director, producer, and I also work as an educator, and often in theater spaces, like in a theater company's education department, I might be brought on to run their playwrights unit or the whatever. Those spaces, the education departments, tend to sometimes operate like social enterprise projects. Like they're like a pat on the back for the theater companies, and bless the theater companies. I don't think any one individual is responsible, but the responsibility spreads so thin. But I think I observe that the theater companies often point to their ed departments with like a pat on the back, like, look at this good thing we're doing. And in those low stake environments, like there are really no consequences for the theater company that comes out of that directly. They're experimental. Oh yeah, bring in this knowledge, bring in that knowledge, bring in that knowledge. But when you put money behind it, when it's the financial reality that the theater company is reckoning with, then all these desires to integrate subjugated knowledges, they become so diluted. They become extremely diluted and very safe. I mean, I think, I earnestly believe everyone wakes up in the morning and wants to do their best and wants to do well and wants to live ethically. But between all the board of directors and the audience engagement and the filling the seats and all of that, what continues to be maintained in the Alberta theater landscape is a commitment to a white normative consciousness or a white supremacist understanding of theater and who theater belongs to. And so there are a few companies that are bold and enterprising and willing to take a few hits as they develop audiences over several years. But this is so layered. I understand this is layered. Like, theater is already a challenging thing to keep afloat. We're a publicly funded art as it is. I don't know. I don't know the answer. I just think like film and TV is making mad money off of marginalized stories. I wonder what the disconnect between theater, why theater is still such a predominantly white institution.
Well, that is a really interesting conversation. And I think a part of it does have to do with the mass production and sharing of film compared to theater. Mm-hmm. Because there is a bit more of a commitment of audience members to theater as compared to film.
Right.
As you're saying, it is such a small part of a multi-layered structure, although it feels like such a similar art form. The barriers that exist between film and theater are so vastly different.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And like film has its plenty of problems. Film and TV have their issues that are, need to be worked with. But generally what I observe with media on Netflix, on Crave, on these different streaming channels, Obviously, there's still a large white Eurocentric presence, but there is a very deep concerted effort to include marginalized experiences in a way that probably never in the history of Hollywood or film and TV, that has never been the case. There is that push in theater, but just to like think about the question of how have I seen this subjugated hegemonic knowledge? How have I seen it in play? I think theaters are really like, they can operate a bit like museums, and they appear to a certain class of people, a certain race of people, a certain sensibility and culture of people. And I love theater, the art form. I love the medium of theater. And that's why I do it, because I just am so activated by the possibility of theater. But the more and more I get involved in the industry, the more I see how people warp and shift and push you into the industry of it rather than the art of it. I don't know what to do about that. Like, I don't know if I want to be an artistic leader at a theater company. I don't know. I want to be an artist, and I just think that sometimes people like me that or similar adjacent experiences and all this we're pushed to these points of artistic leadership in different parts of the country, and that's not always what we wish to be doing, but we are compelled to, or we have to, because somebody needs to usher the change that's being asked.
Mm-hmm.
And that is a conversation that has been brought up. How can the artist exist when being an artistic leader?
Yeah. I just think of like the Daniel McIvers and the Robert Lepage, like they just get to be artists. And the Jordan Tannehill, I love that artist. And I'm not saying this with any judgment, but with a critique of like that they get to be dreamy, starry-eyed artists. Hannah Moscovich, also love her, gets to be that. That's what I want to be. I think I do anti-oppression training out of a need, out of I've been trained as an educator. I think there's a utility in aligning my training, my abilities as a teacher, and my values in anti-oppression. And that's why I do anti-oppression trainings. But I wish I didn't need to ever explain why we need to exist or how we can exist. I wish we could just exist and just be like ecstatic artists that get to write and draw. When I teach playwriting to BIPOC students, I'm always giving them over and over permission to be ecstatic, wild, creative artists, because they all come in, young BIPOC writers come in with a clear political mission. And then I'm like, so what's your aesthetic? So what's your inspiration? So what is your blah, 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 blah? What's your facility with dialogue? All these different things that we don't think we have to think about, or we don't have the luxury of just meditating and ruminating on that. Yeah. I don't know if that answered any of the questions, but there was a tangent.
No, I love that you're talking about the necessity of doing this education. And it kind of comes back to the hustle culture that we live in, the economy that as artists we have to live within. But a question that comes up out of curiosity is just like, how do you make this work not only a necessity, but sustainable and attractive for you to keep going down this path and keep learning for yourself as well?
And do you mean like for artists and leaders, how do they stay engaged in this kind of work? Is that what you mean by that?
I think I mean more like how do you specifically, Makram, you have your two poles of wanting to be the starry-eyed artist, and then also the necessity or the utilizing of your teaching abilities to kind of do this work and also keep yourself afloat as an artist.
Right.
How do you find kind of the joy and find sustainability of continuing to still learn for yourself and continuing to still like do these classes and be able to continue that work while grappling with wanting to be the starry-eyed artist?
Right. I think my work is so tied, like my written work, my artistic work is so tied to socio-political, cultural, and spiritual conversations. And so I'm always engaging because I have an appetite for creating creative work. So that keeps me engaged. But because I'm doing that and then generating creative work, I build a body of knowledges, and then because I have these skills as an educator, I'm able to translate some of it into these workshop ideas or consultation ideas. Like really, what started to happen in order to keep it sustainable for myself was to not do it as often. There was a while where I was taking everything that came my way for consulting and training, and it is just like totally destructive, especially if you're doing it alone, like alone as an organization. My organization is just me, you know what I mean? It's just hard. It's hard to, you put yourself in a position of an educator. People are paying to ask difficult questions, and you have to be vigilant. It goes back to like, what is the challenge of sharing this knowledge? Well, I'm figuring it out as I'm going along. I'm learning and growing. I'm 32 years old. Like, I don't know anything in the grand scheme of my life. You know what I mean? I think when I'm 65 is when I'll write a book that I might know something about, But for now, the work is just so exhausting because I'm figuring it out. And what I hold above everything, I think like a guiding principle that I often share in my workshops and that I hold for myself is that I don't have to understand something fully in order to honor someone's dignity fully. And so these spaces, we come to learn. We can learn and think about hegemonic and subjugated knowledge, or we can engage in these thoughts and these understandings as best as we can. And then at the end of it, if we leave with anything, it's I don't need to understand this fully in order to honor someone's dignity fully. And I think that when there is a lack of honoring someone's dignity, people will set up all sorts of systems of logic to justify their transphobia, their colonization and imperialism, their Islamophobia, their homophobia, whatever it might be. You know what I mean? People like facts and logic are not compelling. They're not compelling to most people. That's what sucks. So this work is complex and exhausting. And so for me to make it sustainable, I have to disengage from teaching, other than if it's really like on my own terms, like a community that I care about, like this engagement lab. It's when it's like that, then I'm able to lean in and do it with full presence. And the fact that a lot of my work is directly like plugged into conversations of cultural and social justice, then I'm always like, I like to read a lot, and reading, I think, is the ultimate form of a practice in listening. And I'm not always successful at reading a lot, but I like to read a lot, and I think it's just really like, rather than get all my information from Twitter or from podcasts, which are a great way, especially long form podcasts, but rather than that, engaging with a book over 20 hours is a different kind of internalizing of information and deep listening to someone who's deeply thought about what they're saying and then articulating it. I'm advocating for reading here. That's how you stay enticed and engaged. But I really do think like we have to read, or listen to audiobooks or whatever. But that long form presentation of a body of knowledge, it's just it's honestly radically changed my life.
You can advertise for reading anytime you want on here.
Great.
This is great because I'm not a reader. So I love this too for you. I'll just hang out with my podcasts.
Podcasts are great. They're great.
And there are 20 hour plus podcasts.
Yes.
That's when you dive into like 5 parts in this one thing, which is great.
That's true. I believe you. No, I agree.
But no, it is this really beautiful thing when you talk about sustainability, and it brings you to this conversation of like, you don't need to fully understand something to fully honor, respect, acknowledge someone's dignity. It's this, it brings us back to this idea that this work is deeply, deeply foundationally based on relationship building. This idea that when you see someone else, and the sublime of being inspired by another individual's pool of knowledge and lived experience, that for me is where the work exists. And it starts very, very fundamentally respecting someone's dignity beyond and before understanding fully.
No one is making a decision to make their lives difficult. No one is choosing to be marginalized, so I have to, we have to lean into the fact that people are completely doing what they know is right for them, what's best for them. And so it's just like the conversation between some like, radical right-wing transphobes that you might hear on YouTube versus what a trans person is saying about their experience. The stakes are like, one is just bothered by witnessing a trans person. The trans person's like, I'm just surviving. I'm just alive. I'm literally existing. And you are so rattled by that. So my faith is going to lie with the person who's just simply trying to exist, who's simply trying to be. That's it. Like, I can't know everything. I will never know everything, no matter how long I live. I will never know everything. And so we have to rest our faith somewhere at the end of this conversation. And mine goes with the people that are solely trying to exist. They're not actively, they're not like, yeah, end of thought.
Oh, and I hear you. It's exhausting to try to know everything.
Yeah.
Then it's again like this idea of when you say I'm my own like individual company, there's a bit of an ease when you work with others, because there's that shared responsibility of knowing that if I don't know something, which I won't eventually, that I have people who probably would.
Yeah.
We hope. That's where like the relationship building is, when you're like, oh, my circle lacks something, maybe time to talk to some other people.
Right.
Yeah, and this brings me back a little bit to the engagement lab, because that was kind of the impetus for us starting, was just to make sure that we could get this group together so that, like, if folks have life paths and different kind of lived experiences, they can come together and have these conversations instead of having these conversations like within their group and kind of siloing these kind of thoughts that they might have. Come together and be like, what happens if we grapple and talk together and kind of, share all of the perspectives so that we can really just like have a more open view of these conversations, right? Now, after the session that you just had with us, can you tell us a little bit about maybe some observations of our group, or maybe some questions or curiosities that you found interesting while engaging with the engagement lab folks?
I think people in the engagement lab had an intuitive understanding of hegemonic versus subjugated knowledges, or dominant versus marginalized knowledge. I think there was in the activity that we did, there was a real complexity in how they sorted identifying the situations in the table where they were asked to identify it as either hegemonic, dominant, or subjugated, marginalized. And there's a complexity. I think it's heartening to me that there's a level of complexity and engagement that we don't always get on quick social media interactions, and there's a understanding that, like my biggest fear in this work is like, okay, so for example, we need to combat Islamophobia, but the point is not to glorify or deify Muslim people to the point of fetishizing. It's a similar idea with Indigenous knowledges. We need to combat anti-Indigenous racism, but we have to not, reproduce the noble savage, the idea that there is something magical about us. What we're trying to all say is we are all human. And not in a sentimental way. I just mean that Muslim people are complex, are queer, are doctors, are civil engineers, are lawyers, are serial killers, are cheaters, are this, are that, all of it, the whole gamut of what white people get to be in their specificity. Guess what? We are also that, as Muslim people, as culturally Muslim people, as queer people, as trans people, as Indigenous people. There is no unified theory of these identities, even though there is a strategy in us being coupled, in us being, there's something called strategic essentialism, where we come together under the umbrella of that identity as a political move. But the reality that we need to espouse is that we are deeply complex. We are deeply multivariable. And so that I've noticed the participants, especially in engaging with that table, that the table activity, is they were talking about that complexity, that we can criticize a homophobic Muslim sheikh. We have to. That's a part of the work. If I'm intersectionally engaging with this work, I have to be able to be mindful that just because we're, you're indigenous or you're Black or you're Muslim it doesn't mean automatically what you say is right. We need that level of complexity. And this is very specific to this community that I'm talking to, our theater community, our predominantly, many of us come into this work radically minded, maybe not radically embodied, but radically minded. And for us, I say there's a value in us having this nuance. Now, if I was talking to like a centrist political group that worked in the government, I might not say, we need to criticize Muslim people for their homophobia. I would not say that. I would say, I will, as a Muslim, culturally Muslim person, not you, And so it depends on the context. But in the context of the engagement lab, I was really heartened to hear the complexity and the nuance.
That's fantastic, because I was also going to bring up context. And I think you are right, that when you think about a couple things, when you think about hegemonic versus subjugated and the legitimizing of knowledge, we see that dogmatic practice in the context of our theater. And we say this in the structures of who gets to legitimize knowledge. We see that constantly when we're in conversation with the board structure versus the artistic structure of a company, and how even within that relationship, the legitimizing of knowledge is very skewered towards one direction. And that comes with the complexities of funding and all that jazz.
I think about it in like the context of my family. Think about like the example of like, I could say my brother is such an asshole, I hate him, blah, blah, blah. And then if my friend is like, God, your brother is an asshole, I hate him, I'd be like, hey, watch yourself. I'm allowed to say that, not you. And that's kind of the same feeling, is like, I'm like, hey, like in Lebanon, we need to get rid of some of these bills and laws that criminalize queerness, homosexual acts, as they say. But if a white guy who's coming into the conversation, who is a conservative, and they're saying the same thing, oh, what do you want Muslim countries to live their truth? Well, go back to Lebanon where you're illegal, your livelihood is illegal. That's a very different in onto the conversation. What I know about my brother is that I deeply love him and I'm committed to him lifelong. What I think about this person who's externally coming and commenting, we don't know their commitment to it. So, and often if like you have someone who's on a different part of the political spectrum that is coming in and criticizing the parts of ourselves that we need work, people that are coming in, I'm curious, what else are they coming in with? Do they hold values that uphold Western knowledges as the best and only way, the dominant ways of being? Then that becomes much more of a polarized conversation rather than how do we come together to work through these problems. It becomes actually my way is right, your way is wrong.
And that is such a fantastic step one in regards to like this conversation. The idea that I am committed to my sibling for a lifelong, and thus I trust myself to put in the work to criticize them in a way that's holistic, and approaching this work with that sort of commitment. Because part of the conversation is, as an artistic leader functioning under these colonial structures, how am I approaching this work? And if we approach it, and this is not, you do this and you fix racism.
Yeah.
But like a way to approach it is, if this is my sibling who I'm committed to for the rest of my life, how am I going to look at this work?
I think artistic leaders have to, and I'm not saying anything new, but it's that your freedom is bound up in mine rather than I am here to liberate you, which sometimes these like, particularly the big arts organizations in Alberta can have that affect. Can have that feeling of, we have all this power. Look at these great programs we're doing for you BIPOCs, for you marginalized. And that, to me, that feels really hurtful, because our freedom is bound up in each other. And it's that egoic, I hold power, I can distribute it. That is something we need to reckon with. I don't know the answer, because they're also right. They do have that power. They do hold that power. And some of the asks over the past 3 years have been, how do we redistribute privilege? But something, and maybe this is like a gap in my own learning or a growth that I'm kind of stuck at. Like I feel like a seed is trying to break through the soil and I just don't know. But I'm like, and I asked this in the workshop, how radical are we willing to be? How uprooting can we transform our society? Some of my Indigenous peers and community members and friends, they say the apocalypse happened to us upon first contact when the Europeans came here. That was apocalyptic for us. And we've been in the apocalypse since then. Black people will say similar sentiments. Black friends of mine, community members, peers will say there's something called the long catastrophe. When they were being sold as slaves and brought over to North America and South America, and they're still in that long catastrophe. So for me, sometimes my tactics and activism are reformists. So long-term, gentle, blah, blah, blah. And I think to myself, should I be more uncomfortable? Should I be more discomforting? It's something that, like I'm saying, it's like I'm a seed trying to break through this soil because I don't know what the answer is. I don't know. I have a natural posture where I am more gentle but firm. So it's not in me to be, what might be seen as aggressive or I don't know. I have a gesture. Is the video part of this podcast?
Can you describe us? Describe us this gesture.
I'm just like pushing my hands forward. I don't know. Like it's that. Like, do I have it in me to do that? And I often fall back on the idea that we need a diversity of tactics in this work. There are those that are championing social action on the streets and politics and government and whatever. And I think my disposition, my natural affinity is to be gentle but firm and to be it's the long-term work is where I find my strategizing. So I write plays about what it was like to be a queer Muslimish kid growing up in Alberta and then becoming the conversion, project to a youth pastor, the first person I ever came out to. So that's a play that I wrote, and I'm hoping through the depiction of that emotional truth, I'm unlocking conversations and engagements with our ethics in a long way, a slow release of it. And then there are others that are doing the immediate work that we need it now, we need it here, we need it. And I'm grateful for those people, and I champion them, and I'm behind them 100% of the way because they're creating better realities for us right now. I think I'm contributing, I'm hoping, I'm endeavoring and striving to contribute to a better transformation of reality in multiple generations. So yeah, all of that.
Simple, easy, straightforward,
Simple.
right?
Yeah. That's so, and see, that kind of answer is so not always helpful for like an artistic director who's running a $15 million theater company. Like they're like, okay, lovely, love it. But also, I think our work as theater artists is the long, slow release. And so we have to be willing to take some losses financially in order to build something that's transformative in the long run. And so I think of like Nina Lee Aquino, who's, been a mentor and a friend of mine, is like incredible. She's now at the NAC. She said in her tenure at Factory Theater, the board was never happy with her because she always chose the shows that felt ethically and morally responsible, the opportunities that were ethically and morally responsible and bending towards a sense of pluralistic justice over the ones that dominated the box office. So her track record financially might not look successful, but she knows ethically. And I think we all do, especially those of us who know her work, we can look at that and say, that's a wildly successful 10 years. Yeah. And now she's at the NAC. I hope that kind of, I know that kind of tenacity is going to be there, but now she has this company that's multiples of millions in it. I hope people can look to her leadership and say, oh, we could do it here and there, It's hard work. I know it's hard work, and I want to maintain love and relationships with everyone.
It's so interesting because you brought this great example of somebody who might not financially look great as like their leadership, wasn't necessarily financially multiplying for the company, but what they did had the tenacity to talk about the things that needed to be talked about.
It's always, we need to make money. We need to
Mhm.
make money. We need to grow the company. We need to grow. We need to maintain our what little power we have. And so it's an operating out of a place of intense fear of losing everything. But if the everything you have is built on white supremacist, capitalist, neoliberal models of triumph, then I go back to that question. That is the seat I'm in, is how radical am I willing to be? Am I willing to advocate for the destruction of capitalism, neoliberalism, the government structures and the systems that we exist in right now? Is that what I want? Is that what you want? Is that what these artistic leaders want? Genuinely, we can all say, I don't like white supremacy. That word is loaded and has teeth. We can all say that. But come to capitalism, neoliberalism, these sorts of understandings that are the matrix of our world, like they are the web that we are floating in. How willing are we to cut that up and create something new?
And it's important to acknowledge like that the landscape of Toronto versus Alberta is, even like the city versus province, is so different, right? So to acknowledge that, but then also to be like, even if we cut up capitalism, that doesn't necessarily equate to complete destruction of your structure. We don't need to rely so heavily on a structure that has been oppressing everyone in the arts for so long.
Right. But it's impossible to think outside of it, and
yeah.
I have to, I think I always try to relate it back to how am I implicated in this? And so if I'm thinking about capitalism, I'm like, how am I participating and benefiting and like it joyfully engaging, and so like when you buy Beyonce tickets, you're engaging in capitalism to the max, and Europe and everyone's into, every anti-capitalist on Instagram is flaunting their tickets, and so like that's a real. So how can I point to artistic leaders and be like, hey, don't engage in it, but then I am in the operating budget of my life, you know what I mean? So it's we have to think about it from a place of how does our spirit work, and it's not to say, oh, I engage in it so thus I validate it. We cannot but engage with capitalism. It's the matrix around us, like it's the webbing around us. But there are ways we can mitigate it. We can transform. We can, in our own little lives, we can try to find the pockets of transformation and mitigation and minimizing the harms, and while advocating for people with bigger power and privilege to do the same. Yeah.
And maintain our ethics and values.
Mm-hmm.
And be kind and forgiving when sacrifices are made.
Yep.
For both ourselves and like for the folks we work with, because it's this work is not easy, but it doesn't always have to be painful.
Right. All the change we want is not going to happen in our lifetime, and so we need to be able to be together in dignity and in care. And so I always use the term a community of care, and despite what I might feel about different houses or artistic leaders or whoever, I do feel I'm up there. We are a part of a community of care. I know consciously and with our words, we are working together. We're on the same side. So when I talk about like, how do we make this work much deeper and more meaningful, much more sublime, is when we confront the realities that we're avoiding internally. Like our buying Beyonce tickets and being anti-capitalist, or all of these different things. How do we reckon with all of that? And how can I hold people to accountability? How do I hold myself to accountability? How do other people hold me to accountability? And how do we give each other grace? And that's what I think a community of care does. That's what a community of care does, or has the potential to do.
And that's something we're all working on and working towards.
It's an active process. It's an active engagement.
Engagement lab?
Yeah, you could say. I didn't even try to set that up.
You're just that good. Is there anything else you'd like to leave us with? Any kind of like from your experience, anything that really like captured you, or just like in general, anything, any last words you'd like to leave us with as like a parting gift?
I
Yeah, no pressure.
No
Yeah.
pressure.
I just want to amplify, like, for the BIPOC, marginalized, queer, trans, disabled, whoever comes from these marginalized experiences that were being called in and ushered onto uh, forging what this new world will look like, how this transformation takes place. I just want to amplify to give yourself permission to be an ecstatic artist. Just let yourself be like that child that couldn't not do, that did shows for their family, that sang all the time, that danced, like live in the ecstasy of that more. Allow yourself to be there more than the organizing and the learning and look, I'm not saying learning isn't important. Of course it is. And I think we will all need inevitably be doing that because we're trying to understand where we are, what in this moment. But there is something in the carnal experience of being an artist that we need to have permission, full permission to do it. And when we're invited into these spaces of power and privilege and predominantly white institutions, come in ferociously as an artist first, and then inevitably, you'll be looked on to bring in perspectives and understandings and knowledges, but fight for your place as an artist, because it's really good. I love nothing more in this world has brought me to life in my life than being an artist. And I know the days when I decided I have to do this. Like, what if I just die and this is it? That's the end of it all. Imagine I live my life not being alive to the fact that I could be an artist and that I could live fully in my artistic reality. And so that's what I want to amplify to BIPOC listeners, particularly. Yeah. And it's just do anything. I'm writing a graphic novel and drawing it. So like, just follow your heart. That's where I'm at.
The full circle back to Marvel.
That's right. That's right. Spread the rumor. I will work for Marvel. Now talk about capitalism there. That's real the epitome of capitalism, artistic capitalism.
Well, pal, thank you so much for being here. And thank you for being a part of the Engagement Lab. It was so lovely to have you come in. So thank you again, just from myself and Jesse. Like, it was so lovely to get to hear your thoughts and have this beautiful conversation.
Thanks for asking me. Thank you for thinking of me, really. I appreciate it.
Bye.
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 The Engagement Lab podcast is possible with the initial support from 3 local foundations to transition our all-in program to the 3550 initiative and the Engagement Lab. The foundations were the Edmonton Community Foundation, Calgary Foundation, and the Rozsa Foundation.
We're thrilled to announce that the Engagement Lab is supported by both Alberta Culture's Community Initiatives Program and the Canada Council for the Arts. Feed Alberta is grateful to our operating funders, the Alberta Foundation for the Arts, the Edmonton Arts Council, and Calgary Arts Development. Thank you so much for tuning in.
And we'll see you next time at the Engagement Lab podcast.